Welcome to True Crime Deep Dive. I am your host, Sherry.
I'm your host, Mark.
Let's dive into it. Today, we're tackling a really tough subject. We're going to take a close look at the 1996 Port Arthur Massacre in Tasmania, Australia.
Yeah, it's a deeply tragic event, still the deadliest mass shooting in modern Australian history, and the impact is definitely still felt.
Absolutely. And this is a difficult topic, as you said, but an important one.
And as we sort of get into our sources, you'll see our goal isn't really about the sensationalism. It's more about understanding, the sequence of events, the perpetrator's background, the immediate aftermath, and maybe most importantly, the huge changes it sparked in Australia.
Right. And we've got quite a range of material to draw on, haven't we? News reports, official documents.
Yeah, personal accounts too. Different viewpoints, which is helpful.
So Port Arthur itself, it's got this incredible history, right? A former prison colony, a really harsh one.
Exactly. But by 96, it was this major tourist spot, known for the history, sure, but also just its beauty.
It's almost hard to picture such violence happening there. Yeah. So let's try and unpack what happened on that specific day, April 28th, 1996.
Okay, so to really get a handle on it, the timeline is key.
Yeah.
The very first victims, we now know, were David and Nolene Martin. They owned a B&B called Seascape.
Seascape, right?
And our sources suggest they were killed probably sometime in the 12 hours before the main attack at the historic site.
And there was a connection, wasn't there, between Bryant and the Martins? A personal one?
A very significant one, yeah. They'll definitely get into that.
Yeah.
It seems central to potentially understanding his motives.
And there's that really unsettling detail about a couple who actually went to Seascape earlier that day looking for a room.
Yes. Chilling, isn't it? They got there, encountered Bryant, who was apparently quite rude, told him his parents were away, his girlfriend was inside, basically just turned them away.
Wow.
They left around 12:35 p.m., feeling, distinctly uncomfortable about the whole thing.
You can only imagine how they felt later. It really foreshadows what's coming, doesn't it?
It really does. So after the killings at Seascape, Bryant drives his yellow Volvo towards the Port Arthur historic site.
The yellow Volvo, right. That becomes quite infamous.
It does. And on the way, he actually stops, chats with a couple whose car had broken down.
Yeah.
Even casually suggested they grab a coffee at the cafe later.
That's just bizarre.
And then, near the Martins' place, Seascape, he runs into a guy called Roger Larner, someone he'd met briefly years before.
Okay.
And what's really telling here, I think, is Bryant kept asking about the Martins. Where were they? Was their property empty? This is before he even gets to the main site.
So that preoccupation with the Martins was already clear. He told Larner some story about surfing, buying property.
Yeah, a total fabrication. But he kept circling back, asking about the Martins' place next door, asking if Larner's wife, Marion, was home, could he go down their driveway?
And Larner offered to go with him.
Right, and at that point, Bryant suddenly changes his tune, says, maybe he'll go into Nubina first, come back later. It just screams premeditation regarding the Martins, doesn't it?
It certainly suggests that was on his mind, very strongly.
Exactly. So he finally gets to the Port Arthur historic site around 1:10 p.m., pays his entry fee, parks the Volvo, initially near the Broad Arrow Café by the water.
But security moved him?
Yeah, asked him to move to the main car park because it was pretty packed that day. He did, but then, interestingly, moved it back again, closer to the cafe entrance. Security noticed him, saw he had a big sports bag, a video camera, but, didn't think too much of it at the time. Tourists carry bags.
Right. And then he went into the cafe.
Bought a meal first, actually. Sat outside on the deck to eat it.
Okay. Anything unusual about his behavior then?
Eyewitnesses said he seemed agitated, nervous, kept looking around back at the car park into the cafe. He apparently made some odd small talk, too, about wasps, or the lack of them, and fewer Japanese tourists, just uneasy.
Setting a very disturbing scene for what came next inside.
Indeed. The Broad Arrow Café, it wasn't huge, and it was crowded that day, lots of people waiting for the ferry.
And then he started shooting.
Just like that. Pointed his rifle at the table right next to him.
Yeah.
Killed 2 visitors from Malaysia, William Ng and Sulang Chung.
Instantly.
Then fired at McSargent, grazed his scalp, and immediately shot Sargent's girlfriend, Kate Elizabeth Skye. She was only 21. The speed. It was horrific.
Just brutal. But there was that moment of incredible bravery, wasn't there? Jason Winter?
Yes, the winemaker from New Zealand. He was helping out in the cafe. Bryant turned towards his wife, Joanne, and their baby. Winter threw a serving tray at him, tried to distract him.
An incredible act. Joanne's father pushed them under the table, too.
Yes, pure instinct to protect them. Just shows the chaos and the courage in those moments.
Mm-hmm.
Then Anthony Nightingale stood up, actually shouted, "No, not here," as Bryant aimed at him.
And he was shot for it.
Fatally. Then boom, 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 Vincent Sharp, Walter Bennett, and Raymond John Sharp killed with a single bullet that went through Bennett first. All had their backs turned.
Oh, man.
The sources say like 15 seconds, maybe a bit more. 17 shots fired inside that cafe. 12 people killed, 10 wounded, just in seconds.
It's almost impossible to process that speed and lethality, and it wasn't over in the cafe.
No. He then moved towards the gift shop area, continued shooting.
The staff there.
2 young local women, Nicole Burgess, only 17, and Elizabeth Howard, 26. Both killed. People were scrambling, desperate to hide anywhere they could.
Yeah, you read about Coralie Lever and Vera Jerry hiding behind a screen.
But Coralie's husband, Dennis, was shot and killed. Others were trapped near a locked door. Pauline Masters, Ron Jerry, Peter, and Carolyn Nash.
Peter Nash lay on top of his wife.
He did, trying to shelter. Gwen Neander was also killed trying to get to that door.
And then he reloaded.
He did. Went back towards the cafe briefly, then returned to the gift shop. And that's when he shot Ronald Jury, Peter Nash, and Pauline Masters. Killed them.
While Carolyn Nash was hidden underneath her husband's body.
Miraculously, she survived. Unharmed physically. But imagine. He apparently aimed at someone else. But the magazine was empty again.
So he reloaded again.
At the counter. Then finally left the building. So in total, inside that building complex, the cafe and gift shop, 20 people dead, 12 wounded. The scale is just staggering.
Staggering is the word. Then he moved outside to the car park.
Yes, the violence just spilled outwards. He shot Royce Thompson, a coach driver, who's just walking along the bus line. He died later.
And Bridget Cook?
She was trying to guide people to cover and she got shot in the thigh. Then Winfred Applin, running for cover, was killed.
And the Quinns. Janet and Neville Quinn, they owned a wildlife park nearby, didn't they?
That's right. They were trying to get away.
Right.
Janet was shot. She fell. Neville managed to get down to the jetty, sort of relative safety.
But he went back for her.
He did, and acted just incredible love and bravery. But tragically...
Bryant saw him.
Not immediately. Bryant first went back to his Volvo, swapped the rifle he'd been using for a different one, a self-loading rifle, more powerful. Then he walked back to where Janet Quinn was lying injured. And he shot her, fatally. Then shot Elva Gaylord, who was sitting on a nearby coach.
My God.
Gordon Francis on another coach, saw what was happening, tried to shut the door, but Bryant shot him from the other coach, wounded him badly.
And then he saw Neville Quinn returning.
Yeah. Chased him around the buses, firing at him. Quinn scrambled onto one of the coaches.
And Bryant followed him.
Onto the coach. And reportedly said something utterly chilling like, "No one gets away from me." Then shot Neville Quinn in the neck, paralyzed him temporarily.
Just relentless cruelty.
After that, the car park carnage. He drove towards the side exit. And that's where he encountered Nanette Meacock and her 2 little girls.
Madeline and Alana, so young.
3 and 6 years old. They'd run quite a distance from the car park trying to escape. Bryant stopped his car.
Did she think he was helping?
Possibly. She moved towards the car. He ordered her to her knees. Shot her. Then shot Madeline.
Then shot Alana. It's just, there are no words for that. Unbearable.
It really is. Then, at the toll booth itself, he blocked a BMW. 4 people inside. Mary Rose Nixon, Russell James Pollard, Helene, and Robert Saltzman.
An argument.
Apparently. He shot Robert Saltzman first, then Pollard as he got out, then Nixon and Helene Saltzman. Killed all 4.
And took their car.
Took the BMW, yes. Along with ammo and fuel they had. Left his Volvo.
And the horror continued even after he left the site?
It did. He drove to a nearby service station, cut off another car. This one had Glenn Pears and his girlfriend Zoe Hall inside.
What happened there?
He forced Glenn Pears into the boot of the stolen BMW. Abducted him. Then, as Zoe Hall tried to get into the driver's seat, presumably to escape her help, he shot and killed her.
So Pears was taken hostage?
Yes. Bryant then drove back towards Seascape, the Martins' property, where this all began hours earlier.
Firing at cars on the way?
Yes, randomly shooting at passing vehicles.
Yeah.
Wounded several more people: Linda White, Douglas Horner, Susan Williams, Simon Williams.
Just spreading terror.
When he got back to Seascape, he dragged Glenn Pears out of the boot, took him inside the guest house, handcuffed him to the stair railing, apparently.
And the BMW.
He set it on fire outside the guest house.
Which must have alerted police, leading to the standoff.
Exactly. And an 18-hour standoff ensued. Police surrounded the guest house.
And it ended with a fire.
The next morning, The guest house went up in flames. Bryant eventually ran out, closed the light, and was captured.
And inside?
Inside, they found the bodies of Glenn Pears. He'd been shot before the fire, it seems, and of course David and Nolene Martin, killed the previous day.
Bringing the final toll.
35 people killed, 23 wounded. An absolutely devastating toll. And it's so important we remember some of those names, Winifred Applin, Walter Bennett, Nicole Burgess, Sue Lang Chung, Elva Gaylord, Zoe Hall, Elizabeth Howard, Mary Howard, Mervyn Howard, Ronald Jerry, Tony Keystone, Dennis and Leslie Lever, Sarah Loudon, David and Nolene Martin, Pauline Masters, Alana and Madeline Mikak, Nanette Mikak.
Each one a life cut short, a family shattered.
Precisely. Each name is a story, a loss that resonates.
It truly is hard to comprehend. Let's shift focus slightly now, if we can, to Martin Bryant himself. Try and understand, if that's even possible, his background, the potential motivations. He was 28 at the time.
Yeah, 28. And financially, he was actually quite well off. He'd received a really significant inheritance back in '92. Money and property from an older friend, Helen Harvey.
Right. And he traveled a lot with that money.
Quite extensively, yes. But our sources really emphasize something else as crucial to his mindset. His father's intense disappointment about the Martins buying Seascape.
The B&B, his father had wanted it.
Desperately. And he felt the Martins had somehow cheated him out of it, acted unfairly. He apparently talked about it constantly, expressed this resentment to Martin, his son.
And this festered.
It seems so. Later, the Martins apparently also refused to sell Bryant's father another property he wanted to buy from them. According to Bryant, he came to believe the Martins had deliberately hurt his family.
And he linked this to his father's suicide.
He seemed to, yeah. His father took his own life in 1983. Bryant saw the Martins as, and these are his words, very mean people, even the worst sick people in my life. That reveals a really deep, burning resentment, doesn't it?
It certainly points towards a potential motive, that sense of grievance, however distorted.
Exactly. And it's also documented, in the months leading up to the massacre, late '95, Bryant was reportedly becoming more isolated, feeling ostracized. Suicidal thoughts were mentioned.
His drinking increased too.
Significantly, yes. Though, importantly, reports say he hadn't drunk any alcohol on the day of the massacre itself.
And he'd been thinking about this for a while.
He apparently told investigators the idea for Port Arthur might have come into his head weeks before.
So, looking at motivations, what seems most likely based on the sources?
Well, two things really stand out. First, that revenge element, specifically targeted at the Martins and linked to Seascape. Given the history, that feels, highly probable.
Right. And the second?
A really disturbing desire for notoriety. His own lawyer mentioned this. Bryant was apparently obsessed with the number of victims, fixated on how many people he'd killed.
Getting some kind of satisfaction from the scale of it?
That's what was suggested, yeah.
Yeah.
Even after being caught, he kept asking, how many did I get?
Yeah.
They deliberately kept the full news from him for a while.
That craving for infamy is deeply unsettling. And it brings us to a really crucial part of this whole story, the gun laws in Australia, before and after.
Absolutely pivotal. The sources are clear. Before Port Arthur, there was already talk about needing gun reform nationally. But Tasmania specifically had always resisted those changes, dug its heels in.
And there was that chilling quote from Barry Unsworth, the NSW premier back in '87.
Yeah, absolutely prophetic, wasn't it? He said it would take a massacre in Tasmania before we get gun reform in Australia. Just devastatingly accurate, as it turned out.
So after Port Arthur, the response was different.
Night and day. The federal government, under Prime Minister John Howard, acted incredibly fast, decisively, within just 2 weeks of the massacre. That's pretty remarkable, really. They announced the National Firearms Agreement.
And this was a major overhaul.
Huge, fundamental, sweeping changes across the whole country. The absolute core of it was strict limits on owning automatic and semi-automatic weapons, the exact kind Bryant used.
Those were essentially banned for private citizens.
Pretty much, yeah. Restricted to very specific licensed purposes. That immediate action is really key to understanding Australia's response.
And a big part of that was the gun buyback, wasn't it?
Massive. A mandatory buyback program. They collected and destroyed something like 643,000 firearms, maybe more.
Wow. How did they fund that?
Cost around 350 million Australian dollars.
Right.
funded by a temporary hike in the Medicare levy, a national health tax. So everyone contributed, essentially.
And the agreement also brought in other measures.
Yeah, a national gun registry was set up.
Yeah.
So much better tracking. And a compulsory waiting period for anyone buying a gun. You couldn't just walk in and buy one anymore.
Was there much pushback against these changes?
Well, there was significant bipartisan support federally, which was crucial. But yes, some state governments, including Tasmania itself and Queensland, initially resisted. Worries about upsetting legal gun owners, farmers, that sort of thing.
Even within Howard's own government.
There were some anxieties, yeah. Concerns about backlash from, more conservative pro-gun elements in their base. But the public mood was just overwhelming.
The grief and anger were just too strong.
Exactly. It basically sidelined the traditional gun lobby. And interestingly, when groups like the US-based NRA and some conservative Christian groups seemed to back the Australian gun lobby, it actually backfired.
How so?
Many Australians saw it as outside interference and, frankly, out of step with the national feeling. It kind of discredited the local lobby even further.
So the reforms went through. What happened at Port Arthur itself in the aftermath? Did the site reopen?
It did, relatively quickly, actually. A sign of resilience, I suppose. But the Broad Arrow Café itself, that was different.
It wasn't rebuilt.
No. The shell of the building was preserved, but it was transformed into a memorial garden, a place for reflection, remembrance, which feels very appropriate.
And the community response?
Profound. A huge fund was set up almost immediately to support the victims, the wounded, their families. A real outpouring of support.
And there's the Alana and Madeline Foundation. That came directly from this tragedy, right?
Yes. Named after Nanette Mikak's daughters, Alana and Madeline. Established in 1997 by their father, Walter Mikak, and others. It does incredible work against bullying, cyberbullying, and supporting kids affected by violence. A really powerful legacy.
A positive legacy from such darkness. You also mentioned a connection with Dunblane.
Yeah. Dunblane in Scotland had his own horrific school massacre just weeks before Port Arthur. So these two communities, oceans apart, found this sort of tragic kinship, shared understanding, mutual support. It was quite moving.
And wasn't there a musical tribute, too?
Yes. The Australian composer Peter Sculthorpe wrote a piece called Port Arthur in Memoriam, dedicated to the victims, a way of processing grief through art.
Of course, Bryant's mental state was heavily discussed afterwards, too.
Inevitably.
Yeah.
It came out he'd been on a disability pension, diagnosed as intellectually disabled. There were stories about, unusual behavior going back to childhood.
Yet he could drive and somehow get those guns.
That was a major point of concern, yes. He didn't even have the right licenses for the firearms he used. It highlighted serious gaps in the system back then.
And there was that copycat effect theory mentioned?
Yeah, forensic psychiatrist Paul Mullen suggested that the intense, sometimes sensationalized media coverage of massacres like Dunblane and then Port Arthur might unintentionally provide a kind of script or even incentive for others. It's a complex and controversial idea, but one that came up.
So what happened to Bryant legally?
He eventually pleaded guilty to everything. 35 counts of murder, plus all the other charges: attempted murder, arson, causing grievous bodily harm.
And the sentence?
35 life sentences, plus additional time for the other crimes. Crucially, without any possibility of parole, he'll never be released.
Where is he now?
He's still imprisoned in Tasmania, at the Risdon Prison Complex, near Hobart. There were actually big security worries, even while he was awaiting trial. Public anger was immense.
Understandably. He was formally sentenced in November 96.
November 22nd, 1996. Sentenced for every single count, with all sentences to be served concurrently, meaning at the same time. Life means life, in his case.
So, as we sort of wrap this up, we've covered the awful events of the day, looked into Bryant's background, the possible motivations.
Yeah, and really importantly, the huge impact it had on Australia's laws. Those gun control changes were profound, and by most accounts, lasting.
It really does feel like Port Arthur was this absolute turning point for Australia, doesn't it? A brutal catalyst for change.
Definitely. The speed and scale of that legislative response is something that's still discussed globally, whenever these awful events happen elsewhere. It showed that major reform is possible after tragedy.
Which leads us to maybe a final thought for our listeners to mull over.
Yeah, something to think about. When you consider everything we've discussed today, the horror, the response, the changes, what does Australia's reaction to Port Arthur really tell us about a society's ability, its capacity for fundamental change when faced with something so devastating?
Or maybe how do these events and everything that followed help us understand that really complex relationship between, one person's horrific actions, the societal context they happen in, and then the power of a decisive legislative response.
Exactly. It's not simple. There are so many layers to it, and its relevance, unfortunately, continues. Something to definitely keep reflecting on. New episodes are going to be released every Tuesday and Friday.
Simple but essential.
Simple but essential information for staying up to date.
Foundational piece of knowledge.
You got it. And with that knowledge, you can engage with our content on your own terms, on your own schedule.
That's the beauty of it.
That's right. So with that in mind, think about this now that you know exactly when to tune in.
Think about the future.
What burning questions do you have out there?
Yeah, what topics are you hoping we'll explore in future deep dives?
What sources are just sitting in your archives, just waiting to be unpacked?
We're ready.
Waiting to have their secrets revealed.
Send them our way.
Send them our way. We're always ready for our next dive.
Always.
Guided by your curiosity.
Yeah.
So until then, keep diving.
Happy listening.
And we'll see you soon.
See you next time.
Take care.
Bye.